Okay, hello. I am going to teach you about wetlands. I now have PowerPoint 365, so there's a picture of me in the corner. Isn't that pretty cool? Okay, so to start off with, we're learning about wetlands. So wetlands are saturated with water. They are typically saturated with water because they have poorly drained soils, and because of this, the key identifier is they have hydrophytic vegetation. So phobic is fearing something, phytic is loving something. So hydrophytic is water-loving plants. So these three things are what define a wetland. So I've included the definition, which I'm now noticing you can't see because of this lovely little picture of me in the corner. I'm going to have to, oh, I guess when you have the PDF of it, you can read the definition. I've included this definition. This is like the textbook definition, so you have it somewhere, but you'll have it, there won't be a little picture of me when you have the PDF version. But they're lands that are seasonally or permanently flooded by shallow water, as well as lands where the water table is close to the surface. In either case, the presence of abundant water has caused the formation of hydric soils, water-saturated soils, and has favored the dominance of hydrophytic or water-tolerant plants. So the difference here being plants that love water, hydrophytic, and plants that tolerate water. Either way, it leads to this. So why are wetlands important? This is my favorite question to ask you guys why. If we were in a classroom right now, I would be asking you guys, why are wetlands important? Why do you think wetlands are important? There's lots of reasons why they're important, and we'll cover a lot of them in today's lecture. But some of the big ones are that there's an important habitat in the ecosystem. A lot of biodiversity is found in wetlands. For humans, it's a huge part of our water purification system. Without wetlands, the water table, wetlands allow the slowing down of water so we don't get flooding, and we have the water seeping down into the water table, and we have aquifers because of wetlands. And then one that I like to mention because we're in Northern Ontario is commercial logging. Most of the boreal forest, not most, much of the boreal forest is black spruce swamps, which is what this picture here is. I'm sorry for a second. I've got a new toy. I'm going to learn how to use it here. It's my laser pointer. This picture is a black spruce swamp. And a lot of our logging in the boreal forest is in these black spruce swamps. So commercial logging happens on wetlands. We have 4 site types that we're going to learn today, as well as 4 wetland types. So there's 8 definitions total that we're going to cover. The 4 site types are how water flows through a system, and that defines what type of wetlands you're going to find there. And then the wetland types are the categories of wetlands based on the vegetation and habitat that you see. So most of these are pretty easy to memorize. Lacustrine or Lacustrine is associated with lakes. Lac, lake. So wetlands that are around the shores of a lake. Riverine, I find this one really easy, or Riverine, are associated with rivers. Palustrine or Palustrine, depending on who you talk to. This is the hard one to remember. These are upslope wetlands that have intermittent flow. So with a river wetland or a lake wetland, you have permanent water all the time. Palustrine are these upland fens and bogs that sometimes have water coming in. So maybe they have a couple of springs or a seasonal river that comes in. So then the outflow is dependent upon that intermittent inflow. So they might not have a ton of outflow either. So these wetlands often you'll find like a stream that's leaving them that has almost disappeared in a dry summer. Palustrine, it's a harder one. They're quite common in this area, but it's a harder one to sort of ID. And then isolated is a wetland has no inflow or outflow, which disappeared for one reason or another. Yeah, no inflow or outflow is an isolated wetland. Usually they have a spring coming up that keeps it there, or completely dependent upon rainfall. So this is one of those wetlands. I'm gonna have some coffee while I'm doing this. I've whited out the answer to the question, but you guys can figure it out if you look carefully at this picture. What is it? Is it a Lacustrine, Riverine, Palustrine, or isolated? So you can see, where's my pointer? I'm going to get out my pointer again. So you can see upland, right? And then they have a swamp. So a swamp is a treed wetland, and then a marsh, which is a high water table wetland. And then look over here, they have a lake. So if we click, we'll see that this is a lacustrine wetland. And because marshes, we'll learn later, marshes are dependent upon good water flow, we frequently see marshes on the edges of lakes. Lacustrine. So this one, we have our upland, another swamp, another marsh, then we have this wet channel of water, another marsh, another upland. So again, pretty easy to tell this is a riverine setting. And again, we're seeing marshes because riverine systems frequently have high amount of nutrients and water flow. Here is a bog or a swamp that has no inflow, and then it has an outflow into another bog or swamp that has an inflow and an outflow, but this is a really tiny outflow and a pretty boggy inflow. So this is our classic Palustrine wetland, or Palustrine wetland. And we see, anytime you see like these peat boggy sort of situations, these fens and bogs, we've got several of them in the area. Palustrine. And then lastly, these ones pretty easily, because we have a wetland here with no water flow. They're just little pockets. And you do see these in the boreal forest frequently, where there's this little pocket wetland. And a lot of them are dependent upon rainfall, and some of them are dependent upon water table. But these are isolated wetlands. Let's get my arrow off. So now that we have the 4 site types, now we're going to look at those 4 wetland types. So these are marsh, fen, bog, swamp. And this is very general descriptions I've put here. I'm going to go into each one of them in more detail. But generally, our marshes are nutrient rich. They have a lot of diversity, dominated by grasses. Fens and bogs both are low in nutrient, and then they sort of go down the scale of nutrients, where you can have a high nutrient fen, which is practically a marsh, and a low nutrient fen, which is borderline bog. So bogs are the most nutrient deficient. They have the least amount of water flow and the least amount of species diversity. You will see in a fen more sedges and mosses than you will see in a bog, and a lot more species diversity. Bogs are going to be dominated by sphagnum moss and ericaceous shrubs. And I'll talk more about what ericaceous shrubs mean, but it's in North Bay growing up, we always called it tea brush, but it's things like laurel and sweetgale and leatherleaf, these low shrubs. Blueberries count as ericaceous shrubs. And then last is swamp. Swamps are dominated by trees. So there's lots of different kinds of swamps. If the wetland is mostly trees, it's a swamp. But it means that it's also probably fairly nutrient rich, or else you wouldn't be able to support a tree growing, right? So swamps are a pretty nutrient rich system. Now we'll go and talk about each one a little bit better. So here is my definition of marsh. So we need to have at least 25% or greater emergent plant cover. So this is a distinction where marshes tend to have so much open water that if you have less than 25% coverage, water, and just tufts of grass, less than 25% tufts of grass, now you're looking at an open water system and you're not looking at a marsh. So you need to have at least 25% cover open emergent plants. You're going to have standing water or slow moving water. So if you've got the water moving fast through the system, you've got a river, not a marsh. It is nutrient rich and it's there for most of the season. So water inundated, you might get some dry times in the middle of the summer, but mostly marshes are wet year round. They do get seasonal flooding where they'll have low water table in the summer and then really high water tables in the spring. Neutral pH, so your typically water is neutral, and you're going to find that a lot of these wetlands, they become more acidic. So marsh being neutral, that's our baseline. If it's non-woody plants, and you get a lot of diversity because you have a lot of nutrients. So then I've got pictures. Here is like, to me, this is like the classic marsh. Lots of graminoids, lots of open water, but definitely more than 25% coverage of those grasses. No trees, although you can have one or two little deciduous trees popping up, but it's dominated by those graminoid species, grasses, sedges, reeds, brushes, not any ericaceous woody shrubs. Here's also a marsh, but this one is less water flow happening, so the few less nutrients. But again, lots of water, lots of graminoids, not a lot of woody situation. This one's mostly cattails, but it's still mostly graminoids, mostly emergents, mostly cattails, but not mostly trees. Not mostly ericaceous shrubs, and a good flowing river through the middle of it. So this is a riverine marsh. This is probably a riverine marsh as well. It could be a lacustrine marsh, but you getting the idea here. Lots of grasses, lots of cattails, not a lot of shrubs. Oh, I want to talk about water meadows because this is something you see in Europe. It's not as common around Ontario, but you'll have these fields that are farmed and they have short grasses, and sometimes you'll see like sheep or cows in them. And I wonder if at one point they would have been marshes, but now humans have sort of recognized that they're only flooded for a few months of the year, and the rest of the time they can use that land as pasture land. So you see these water meadows in a lot of places in Europe. And I'm wondering if they would have been wild marshes at one point. So these are some examples of meadows. Yeah. This is a more wild example where they haven't turned it into pasture land, but it's seasonally flooded. All right, so our next one on our list is a fen. So fen and bogs have what we call peat soil. Peat is basically sphagnum moss that then becomes soil. So the dominant component of a fen soil is sphagnum moss. It's a peat-based soil. It's an organic soil. The water table is usually at the surface or just below the surface, so you can walk through a fen and keep your feet dry sometimes. Usually, depending on the time of year, you're going to get a little wet mow, though. You do see some water movement in a fen. In a bog, you're not going to see the water movement. In a fen, there might actually be a moat or some kind of a stream, like little rivulet going through the fen where you see the water movement. Not necessarily. Sometimes on a slope, the soil now is starting to get slightly acidic because there's not as much movement and the vegetation is acidic. And fens typically were going to be dominated by sedges. Sedges are more acid tolerant than grasses, and mosses. And then we need to make sure that we have fewer than 25% tree coverage because we want to see that it's not a swamp. But in a fen, you do start to see some tamaracks growing. And if it's a really nutrient-rich fen, you might have some maples, but typically it's tamaracks and spruces. So this could be a marsh, but depending on the species present in the acidity, it could also be a fen. So this is on our nutrient-rich side of a fen that's almost a marsh. And I wouldn't expect you guys to be able to ID a wetland such as this. This is a tricky one where we'd have to look and see, are there some, what is the acidity of the water? What is the acidity of the soil? Is it dominated by sphagnum moss? Is it dominated by sedges or grasses? How much species diversity is there? But some fens can look a lot like a marsh. This is a more typical fen. This is like classic Northern Ontario, like I have been in fens like this, where you have a lot of sedges. And I know when you see this, you're seeing, oh, that's a lot of grass. But a lot of things that we call grass are actually sedges. And I'll talk about the difference between sedges and grasses in a different presentation in lab. Usually I would talk about it in lab, so I'll think about where I'm going to do that with this new online format. But we're seeing pockets of water, we're seeing some trees along the edge, some spruces, tamaracks, not a lot of water flow. So this is probably a medium nutrient, possibly a nutrient poor fen. But you're seeing pockets of water. In a bog, you probably wouldn't see this much water. So, and in a true bog, your species diversity would be so low, there'd be fewer than 12 species, fewer than 14 species. Here's another fen, again, borderline marsh, less water, more plants, more sedges, more mosses. Fens are that in-between stage that's harder, it's less distinct about what makes it that way. So now we go into bogs. Bogs are really specific. And this is sort of something that has changed over the years. When I was a student, if it was dominated by ericaceous shrubs and sphagnum, it was a bog. If it was dominated by sedges, it was a fen. But now, a lot of things that I would have included as a bog, because there were ericaceous shrubs and sphagnum, I would have said it was a bog. But now people are saying, no, that's probably a poor fen. It has to be very specific to be a bog. Again, I'm not going to be this pedantic. We're learning. But what makes it a bog is it has peat soil, just like a fen, and it has a water table, just like a fen, that's at the surface or below, and typically bogs are going to be below more so. You rarely see a bog that's soaking wet, and sometimes you do, but it's super low water movement. You're not going to be seeing pockets of water everywhere. It's because there's less water movement, again, the soil, the water becomes more acidic, the soil becomes more acidic, and the nutrient level is much poorer. So because you have that poor nutrient, you have way fewer diversity of plants and animal species. So we'll see if you see fewer than 14 species of plants, you're probably in a bog. Again, we want our tree cover not exceeding 25%. Because then it would be a swamp. And you're typically, if you see any trees, it's just black spruces. If you're seeing a bunch of tamaracks, you're probably not in a bog, you're probably in a poor fen. We're usually having a lot of ericaceous shrubs because they're able to withstand that acidity, and raised hummocks because of the way the soil is. You'll see these sort of hummocks of moss and shrubs. So this is classic bog. You can't even see the water. You can see these raised hummocks of ericaceous shrubs and some sedges sticking up in there. And then a few little baby spruces popping up. Another example, so they don't look quite as wet as the other wetlands. And that's a big thing, like you're not seeing any water. But a poor fen would look very similar. Like a poor fen would look like this, but more moss, more sedge, and less woody shrub. And then we have that sort of, where does it become a bog or a black spruce swamp? And in Northern Ontario, we frequently say black spruce bog. We'll say, oh, that's a spruce bog. And if there's more than 25% tree coverage, it's not a spruce bog, it's a spruce swamp. But it's one of those situations where typically swamps have way more nutrients to support those trees. And if you're seeing more trees, is it a bog or is it a swamp? Spruce bogs have lower nutrients in their soil than typical swamps. But sometimes where that line changes from bog to swamp is difficult depending on where you are in the boreal forest. So swamps are easy. We've got trees. And then here I'm saying greater than 6 meters tall. We do have things called tall tree swamps and then low tree swamps. So we'll have like shrub swamps, tall shrub swamps. So an alder swamp is a swamp. But trees are greater than 6 meters tall. So a tall human is 2 meters. So you're thinking like 3 basketball players is a tree. Anything lower than that is a tall shrub. But the key thing here is more than 25% coverage. So more than a quarter of the landscape is treed. You typically have some gently flowing water. And like in those conifer boggy swamps, sometimes the water is just standing, it's not flowing quite so much. But you're getting a more neutral pH. And again, those boggy swamps might be slightly acidic, but in order to support trees, you've got to have at least some nutrients and a good pH in your soil. Some of these swamps are flooded seasonally, and others are flooded constantly. You're getting more oxygen and more minerals. We are just saying that to support trees, you need that. And then I was mentioning earlier thicket swamps. So those tall shrubs like alders and willows will be a swamp despite the trees not being 6 meters tall. So I'll show you. This is the classic sort of southern bayou with cypress trees kind of swamp, and they're permanently flooded. You can go on canoe trips through some of these swamps in the southern states. But our typically are seasonally flooded. So here is a maple swamp. So it's probably silver maple or the most water tolerant. But some of them are seasonally flooded. So this one, oh, it won't let me go backwards. So the last slide was probably flooded most of the year, and you can tell this one is seasonally flooded where the plants have been sort of pushed down by the snow and the water table will probably recede with summer. This is an ash swamp. This is not from the cranberry trails, but we have ash swamps very similar to this on the cranberry trails between North Bay and Callender. So if you're from the area, you might have seen those ash swamps where the water is flooded for a good portion of the summer. And then this is what I was talking about with thicket swamps. So I couldn't find a picture where you were under the thicket, but in a good thicket swamp, you can sort of stand in it. These trees are taller than me, but I can't really walk through them quite so much because they're more shrubby. But they do typically get tall enough that there's an understory where the species are not growing quite so well. In a forest or a swamp, you don't have as many understory species because the trees are blocking the sunlight. So in a thicket swamp, you get the same thing, where there's an understory and an overstory, but the trees are less than 6 meters tall. All right, so there's our 4 different types of wetlands, and if you go on Blackboard, I have some activities to practice those 4 different wetland types, as well as the site types. I also included a general description on, I think it's in the lecture portion of Blackboard, it might be in the lab portion of Blackboard, where I have the 36 eco sites that you can put wetlands into, so then you can take those bogs and swamps, Palustrine, and segregate them more into ecosites based on the dominant species and the dominant soil type. So you can say this is a black spruce bog versus a tamarack bog, or swamp, I mean, black spruce swamp versus a tamarack swamp. And there's 36 different wetland ecosites. And a lot of them are based on indicator species, presence of different species growing there. So I don't expect you to know all of them, but we're going to do a wetland report, and that information might help you with your report. It might not. We'll talk more about that. So in summary, for this particular PowerPoint about types of wetlands, we've got the 4 site types, right? Lacustrine, Riverine, Palustrine, isolated. Those are about the water of the habitat and how that water flows. The 4 wetland types, bog, fen, marsh, swamp, that's about the soil type as well as the dominant vegetation and the nutrients. And then the 36 wetland ecotype sites that I don't expect you to memorize those 36 sites. But the idea that you can then take these other 8 classifications and narrow them down into specific habitats. So with the wetland ecosites, you then have, I know that wetland ecosite site 12 is going to be a conifer swamp. And you know what kind of site type and wetland type that is, as well as other things about that. You know what the soil is going to be like, what the vegetation, understory vegetation are possibly going to be. It gets more specific. So go on Blackboard. I have some activities and quizzes for you to practice these things. Read through the content on there, go through this PowerPoint, and then I think I actually have an actual quiz on some of this content, but the quiz also includes content on the other half of this PowerPoint. So there's 2 PowerPoints. I've split this lecture because it's usually a 2-hour lecture. I've split it into 2 shorter PowerPoints rather than sitting you down for a whole hour while I talk. Yeah, go check out the other PowerPoint. Go check what else is on Blackboard. Practice so that you know these things. Okay.